What happens when the system meant to protect us fails? When a man who gave his life to serve his country loses everything, his home, his dignity, and the one creature who ever truly loved him? David Johnson, a homeless veteran, found himself fighting not just for justice for his dog, but for his own sense of humanity. This is the story of a man who refused to be silenced. But after everything he's been through, the question remains, will there be justice? Before we dive into today's story, let us know in the comments where in the world are you watching this video from. We'd love to hear from you. Meet David. For years, he has lived a life of survival, a life no one truly understands unless they've walked a mile in his shoes. A life shaped by loss, sacrifice, and the harsh realities of being invisible in a world that doesn't want to see you. But there's one thing David had left in this cold world, a reason to keep going, a light in the darkness, his dog, Max. Through every sleepless night on the concrete, through every cruel encounter with people who judged him for his appearance, his mental state, or his circumstances, Max was there. A companion who didn't care about his past, who didn't care that he was homeless, or that the world had written him off as just another forgotten soul. Max loved him unconditionally, and that's all David needed, just someone to show him love. And in return, David gave Max his heart. David had been a soldier once, a man who served his country, who fought battles for freedom and justice. But the war didn't end when he came home. The real battle began in the streets, on the fringes of society. Once a proud man with a uniform, now just another face among the invisible. But through it all, Max never judged. Max never turned away. It wasn't much, but David and Max had each other, and for a man with nothing left to lose, that was everything. Every morning, they woke up together, greeted the harsh sun together, and found shelter for the night together. They fought the loneliness together. And for David, that was enough. He didn't need much, just the comfort of knowing Max was by his side. But one day everything changed. What seemed like another ordinary morning in a life of struggle would soon become a nightmare that David could never have imagined. On that fateful day, the world that David had come to know, the only world he had, was ripped apart in an instant. The police arrived unannounced, and Max, ever the protector, did what any dog would do. He barked. He stood his ground, trying to protect the only person who had ever cared for him. David told Max, "No, stop, boy, please." But what happened next, no one could have predicted. In a split second, Max, the only family David had left, was silenced forever, just like that. The shots rang out, echoing in David's ears, and his heart shattered. Max, the dog who had stuck by him through every moment of pain, every moment of fear, every moment of loneliness, was gone. And in that moment, David wasn't just a homeless veteran, he wasn't just a man who had lost his way. He was a broken soul, left with nothing. The bond he had with Max, a bond stronger than anything this world had to offer, had been shattered in an instant. That morning, the streets that David had come to call home turned into a battleground. He had no way of knowing it, but everything was about to change. Max, his constant companion, lay still beside him, unaware of the storm that was coming their way. David had seen the police before. They came around every now and then, checking for anyone in need of a ticket or an eviction, but this was different. This time, they were coming for him, they were coming for Max. David froze for a moment, his heart sinking in his chest. He knew why they were here. They had no reason to be kind, no reason to be gentle. They were the law, and in their eyes, he was just another piece of trash on the streets, something to be cleared away. But Max was everything to him, his last piece of dignity, his last shred of a family. David told, "Stay calm, buddy, stay calm, please, we don't need trouble today." David tried to keep calm, but Max wasn't the kind of dog who backed down from danger, not when he sensed his owner was in trouble, not when he had been trained by years of experience to protect David no matter the cost. Officer number 1, with a stiff tone. You're going to have to pack up and move along. This area's off limits. Now, move it. David, voice trembling. Please, we're not hurting anyone. We're just trying to survive. My dog, he won't hurt anyone. Officer number 1, annoyed. Enough talking. Pack up or we'll have to remove you forcibly. Your dog needs to calm down or we'll have to handle him. David, pleading. Please, just don't hurt him. He's just protecting me. He's not dangerous. He's my best friend. Officer number 2, gruffly, step back from the dog, now. In that moment, something inside David snapped. He had seen enough. He had felt enough. He wasn't going to lose Max. Not after everything they'd been through. Not after all the pain. But in a heartbeat, the officers made their move. There was no hesitation, no warning, they just reacted. David told, "No! Max, no!" In that split second, everything David had fought for, everything he had left in this cruel, unforgiving world, was taken from him. The bond he shared with Max, a bond built on years of loyalty and love, had been torn apart. And in the silence that followed, all that remained was a man with nothing left to lose. And as the world continued to turn, as the officers walked away without a second glance, David was left to face the unbearable truth. In a world that had already failed him, this was the final betrayal. Everything happened so quickly. The world that David had come to know, the one that was cruel, unforgiving, yet somehow still familiar, had just crumbled before his eyes. And in the aftermath, there was only one thing left to face, the heartbreaking reality that his loyal friend, his protector, his family, was gone. David had lived through his fair share of hardships. He had lost so much in his life, a once promising future shattered by war, by PTSD, by abandonment, but nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared him for the moment he had to watch his dog, his best friend, be taken away from him so senselessly, so violently. David told Max, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." He had promised Max that he would protect him, that no matter what, he would keep him safe. But in the moment, he couldn't protect him from the one thing that mattered most, the cruelty of the world around them. David knew that, in the eyes of the world, Max's death would be nothing more than a statistic, just another dog, just another homeless man, just another incident that would be swept under the rug. The officers would move on with their day, the city would keep turning, and David would be left to pick up the pieces of his broken heart, alone. There was no apology, no remorse, no offer of support, just the cold, heartless reality that Max's life meant nothing to those who had taken it. And in that moment, David realized something he'd known all along. The world had no place for someone like him. A homeless veteran, discarded and forgotten, with nothing to offer but his pain. As he sat there, surrounded by the remnants of his life, his tattered belongings, his broken dreams, the place that had once been his home, David couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of betrayal. The system that had failed him in every way had now taken the one thing that had kept him going, his companion, his friend, his family. David told, "They didn't have to do this, Max. They didn't. Why didn't anyone care about you, about me?" In that moment, David was no longer just a man mourning the loss of his dog. He was mourning the loss of a world that had never once cared for him. He was mourning the loss of hope, of the belief that someone, anyone, might ever show him the kindness and decency he had given to Max. The world had turned its back on David long ago, and today it turned its back on Max too. In a world that had no use for either of them, there would be no justice. There would be no recognition of the love they had shared. Only silence. Only an unspoken message that in this world, some lives, some beings, are worth less than others. And in the days that followed, nothing changed. The officers went back to their routine. The city carried on. But for David, nothing would ever be the same. He was left with the unbearable emptiness of knowing that Max, the only true friend he had ever known, was gone, and he was left alone once again to face the world that had turned its back on him long ago. In the weeks following Max's death, David's grief was consuming. It felt like the world had forgotten about him, the man who had served, who had fought for his country, who had given everything, only to be discarded. But through the darkness of his sorrow, something started to stir. A flicker of something long buried, a glimmer of hope. David began researching. He searched tirelessly for any way to get justice for Max, for what had happened that fateful day. He read the stories of people who had fought for their rights, for their dogs, for those who had been wronged by the system. It wasn't just about Max anymore, it was about standing up to the injustice that had been inflicted on him, and on so many others like him. He discovered there were others who had been through the same thing, other veterans, other homeless individuals who had lost their beloved pets to the same senseless violence. And while the world had ignored their pain, their stories were being heard, and David, for the first time in a long time, felt like he wasn't alone. David told, "I need to do something, I can't just sit here and let them get away with it. Max didn't deserve this, none of us do." That phone call marked the beginning of something larger. David wasn't just a homeless veteran anymore, he was a man who had suffered the ultimate loss and was determined to make sure that loss would not be in vain. The fight for justice, his fight, was just beginning. He filed complaints with the police department, he spoke to local journalists, he shared his story with anyone who would listen, and slowly people started to take notice. His words resonated, his pain became their pain. The system, for the first time, was being forced to acknowledge the injustice that had taken place. Reporter on TV. A homeless veteran is speaking out after a police shooting killed his service dog in an altercation last month. David Johnson, who served in the military, says his dog Max was shot after a police officer felt threatened by the dog's growls. Johnson is calling for accountability from the officers involved, saying his dog was only trying to protect him. The media coverage was a turning point. For the first time, David's story wasn't just an isolated incident, it was part of a larger, growing narrative, a movement that was beginning to gather momentum. The injustice he had faced was now being recognized. His voice, once silenced, was now being heard. David told, "Max wasn't just a dog, he was my friend, my family, and what happened to him wasn't just a tragedy, it was an injustice. I'm here today to make sure that no one else loses their best friend the way I lost mine. We need a change, we need accountability, and I won't stop until we get it." David's courage sparked something. His words ignited a fire in others, activists, veterans, animal lovers, people who had been watching from the sidelines but now saw the opportunity to stand with him. The fight for justice for Max was no longer just David's fight, it was everyone's fight. And with every step forward, his message became clearer. This injustice would not go unanswered. It wasn't just the media, it wasn't just the activists, the people, the everyday men and women who had once ignored David and Max were beginning to rally behind the cause. There were petitions, public outcry, calls for accountability. The voices of the voiceless were rising, and the police department couldn't ignore it any longer. David didn't know where this fight would take him. He didn't know if he would win, but he knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't give up. Max's death would not be in vain, and he would fight until justice was served. Days had passed since David began his crusade for justice, but with every phone call, every meeting, every new lead, the truth seemed to slip further and further from his grasp. The police department had promised to cooperate. The investigation into Max's death was ongoing, but something felt wrong, something felt hidden, and David could sense it in his gut. Sarah told David, "There's something I need to tell you, something you won't want to hear, but it's the truth. I've been digging into the case and I've uncovered some information that doesn't sit right." David told, "What are you talking about?" "What have you found?" Sarah told David, "The officer who shot Max, Officer John Carter, has a history that's been swept under the rug. There have been complaints, multiple complaints, about his handling of situations with animals, and there's evidence to suggest he might have acted recklessly before." David told, "Recklessly? How many times? How far back does this go?" Sarah told here, "Back in 2018, there was a case where Officer Carter shot a dog in a similar situation unprovoked. It was ruled justified because the dog appeared threatening, but the department never did a thorough investigation. There were witnesses who claimed the dog was just barking, not attacking, but the reports were buried." David told, "So this isn't the first time? He's done this before, and they let him get away with it?" Sarah told, "Yes, and there's more. I found a connection between Officer Carter and a private animal control service that's known for its brutal methods. There were rumors that Carter had been involved in incidents where animals were unnecessarily euthanized or harmed, but no one ever followed up on it." David told, "Why was this covered up?" "Why didn't anyone tell me this sooner?" Sarah told. "Because the department didn't want to admit they'd let a dangerous officer slip through the cracks. It's easier to bury the reports, to sweep it all under the rug." "You're not the first person this has happened to, David, but with your case getting so much attention, things are starting to unravel." As Sarah continued to dig deeper into the investigation, the walls began to close in on Officer Carter. More witnesses came forward, people who had seen his reckless behavior, who had heard the rumors of his violent actions. The police department, once so tight-lipped about the incident, began to crack under the pressure of the public eye. The revelations were coming fast, and they were more damning than David could have ever imagined. With every passing day, the case against Officer Carter grew stronger, the evidence didn't lie, the public outrage was palpable, and as the pressure mounted, more eyes turned to David, this once invisible, forgotten man, now the face of a movement, a man fighting not just for his dog, but for every person and animal who had suffered at the hands of an abusive system. But the fight was far from over. The investigation was only the beginning. For David, this wasn't just about seeking justice for Max. It was about exposing the corruption, the brutality, and the abuse of power that had gone unchecked for far too long. And as the investigation unfolded, one thing became clear. David was no longer a victim. He was a force of nature, driving forward, demanding justice, and with every piece of the puzzle that fell into place, the world saw the truth that had been buried for so long. The story that David had started was no longer just his own. The fight for justice had spread like wildfire. What had started as a single man's battle for the memory of his dog had become the rallying cry for so many others who had been ignored, dismissed, and forgotten. The injustice done to Max was no longer just about one life lost. It was about a system that had repeatedly failed its most vulnerable, and the public was done staying silent. Protesters told "Justice for Max, justice for Max, justice for Max." David never could have imagined this kind of support. For so long, he had been a voice in the dark, crying out against a system that refused to listen. But now he stood surrounded by thousands of voices. Each chant, each sign, each voice was a testament to the fact that David's pain was not his alone. It was shared, it was collective, and it was loud. What had started as a small movement, a few voices echoing in the silence, had now turned into a full-blown demonstration. People from all walks of life, veterans, activists, pet lovers, everyday citizens, had come together, united by a single cause: justice for Max and justice for the countless others who had been victims of a broken system. David told, "This fight isn't just about Max anymore, it's about every single one of us who has been overlooked, forgotten, ignored. It's about holding the system accountable for the lives it has taken and the ones it has destroyed." We are here today not just to seek justice for Max, we are here to demand justice for all of us. Protesters told, "We won't stop, we won't stop, we won't stop until justice is done." As the protests spread across the city, David realized something incredible. This wasn't just about exposing one officer's wrongdoings anymore. This was about exposing a much larger issue, one that had been buried for too long. The authorities, once so eager to ignore David's cries, now found themselves facing an entire movement, one that was loud, determined, and impossible to silence. The media was covering the protests, the public was paying attention, and the police department was now under a microscope, and they had nowhere to hide. Reporter on TV speaking into the camera. Protests erupted today in the city's downtown district as a growing number of citizens came out to support David Johnson, a homeless veteran who has become the face of a movement calling for justice after his dog was shot by a police officer. The protest has been peaceful, but tensions are high as local authorities continue to face questions about the officer's past conduct and the handling of the case. The public outrage continues to grow, and there are calls for action from city officials. David, shouting over the chants to the crowd, "We are the change. We are the ones who will hold this system accountable. We will not rest until we see justice for Max and for everyone who has suffered at the hands of those who were supposed to protect us. This is our fight, and we will win." What had once been a single voice, broken and alone, had now become a chorus, an unstoppable force demanding justice. The protests were not just about Max's death, they were about exposing the cracks in a system that allowed abuse to flourish unchecked. They were about fighting back against the silence, against the indifference, against the apathy that had kept so many in the dark for so long. The protests were just the beginning. The system had been shaken to its core, and no one, least of all David, was going to stop until the fight was won. The protests had grown louder, the voices stronger, but now, as the case entered the courtroom, the stakes had never been higher. The world was watching. David had fought for so long, fought for justice, fought for accountability, and now here he was, standing before the very system that had failed him and Max. But would this be the moment he'd been waiting for? Would the truth finally be heard? Or would the same forces that had allowed Max's death to slip into the shadows once again succeed in sweeping it all under the rug? Judge told, "Let the proceedings begin." David had done everything in his power to bring the truth to light. He had rallied the masses, gathered evidence, and fought back against the very forces that had tried to silence him. But in that moment, standing before the court, he felt the weight of uncertainty. Would the jury listen to the truth? Would they see past the badges, the uniforms, the carefully crafted defense that Officer Carter's team would surely mount? Prosecutor told, "We are here today because of a tragic death, a death that could have been prevented." Officer Carter's actions were reckless, unjustified, and have left a man broken, a community in pain, and a nation questioning the very institutions meant to protect us. The evidence is clear, and the truth is undeniable. Max did not deserve to die that day, and neither did David. The evidence was overwhelming. The investigation had uncovered too many truths, too many damning facts. But there was still that nagging question in David's mind. Could the system, the very system that had failed him for so long, finally give him what he deserved? Could the people who had been blind to his pain now open their eyes and see the truth? Defense attorney told Officer Carter was simply doing his job. He was acting in self-defense. Max, though David's beloved companion, posed a threat that any reasonable officer would have reacted to. The officer's actions were justified, and any attempt to suggest otherwise is based on emotion, not fact. This was not an act of malice, it was an unfortunate but necessary decision. With every word, the defense tried to undo the progress David had made, tried to paint Officer Carter as a man who had acted in good faith. But David knew the truth. He knew what happened that day, and he wasn't about to let Max's death be twisted into something it wasn't. Prosecutor told, "The truth is simple. Max did not deserve to die. He was a dog, a service animal, a protector, and David, his owner, his best friend, did not deserve to lose him." Officer Carter did not act out of fear, he acted out of impulse, out of a lack of training, and out of a culture that is willing to sacrifice innocent lives. It is time to hold him accountable. As the jury deliberated, David stood at the precipice of a new chapter in his life. But even after everything, the protests, the investigations, the media attention, he knew the fight wasn't over, and the question lingered in the air. Would there be justice? Would this broken system finally recognize his pain and give him the justice he deserved? Or would it continue to protect the very forces that had caused so much harm? With the jury deliberating, David's future and the future of many others hangs in the balance. The world is waiting, and now so is David. But the fight, he knows, is far from over. No matter the outcome, his voice has been heard, and that in itself is a victory. Do you think David will get the justice he deserves, or will the system protect those who fail to protect us? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel.